the freest experience that the Jewish community had ever known in its history. I'm a boomer. I'm a classic boomer, born in 1953. One of my earliest memories of my childhood was at age 14, in the months leading up to the Six-Day War. My parents on the phone round the clock making phone calls to raise money for Israel, and there was a palpable feeling that if a war happened, if several Arab armies invaded Israel, Israel would be destroyed. And I remember the sense that somehow this was a family crisis. This wasn't a problem happening in a country overseas. It was a family crisis, that the promise of the Jewish people and the Jewish future was at risk. 9 years later, I was on a bus, the number 5 bus, and it gives me chills because we know the suicide bombing on the number 5 bus. We've both been on it in Tel Aviv, goes around Dizengoff. I'm on the number 5 bus in Tel Aviv when the bus put on the Chadashot on the hour, and they announced the rescue raid in Entebbe, when Jewish passengers were actually isolated. Palestinian terrorists had hijacked a plane. Non-Jews were allowed to go. The Jews were held as hostages, and the Israelis mounted a 1,000-mile, 3,000-mile rescue mission to save the Jews in that airport. And I remember that moment when the Chadashot played, all the traffic on Dizengoff stopped, including our bus. Everyone stood up, and we sang Hatikvah. A third formative memory of my childhood, I made my first trip to Russia with USY in 1970, visiting and refusing. So I went back several times afterwards, and my activism for the Soviet Jewry was the defining activism of my childhood, of my teen and young adult years. 25 years later, I was the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Washington, and was one of the organizers of the Summit Rally for the Soviet Jewry in 1987, December 6th. Day I'll always remember because I was standing on the stage with then Vice President George Bush, with recently released prisoner of conscience Natan Sharansky, and with Peter Paul and Mary Hussein. And on that day, when we expected maybe 25,000 people to come, 250,000 people showed up. And on the next morning, when Ronald Reagan met with Premier Gorbachev, the meeting began with him holding up copies of the Washington Post and the New York Times saying, 250,000 people rallied to free Soviet Jews, and he said very clearly, Prime Minister Gorbachev, there will be no free trade, there will be no reduction in arms, there will be no most favored nation trade status unless you free Soviet Jews. I share those because if my parents' generation was the generation of tragedy and rebirth, my generation experienced what I would call the heroic stage of Jewish communal life. The heroic stage, Six-Day War, Entebbe raid, Summit Rally for the Soviet Jewry, which turned the corner on that human rights struggle. What about my children's generation? Now we're talking about Generation X, Y, and millennials, born in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. What's formative for that generation? They lived during the Conference on Racism in Durban in 2001, which suddenly, with the passage of apartheid South Africa, now elevated Israel to the #1 status of pariah nation in the world. A few months later, Second Intifada, suicide bombings threat Israel. Given the freedom of Israel, ironically, the ability of both media and human rights organizations to report on every abuse of human rights issues in Israel became the new brand of Israel. Israel was no longer the David that defeated Goliath in 1967. It was the nuclear power in the Middle East that was oppressing poor Palestinians. And most recently, Israel invades Gaza, a Goldstone Commission, a committed Jew, who suggests that both Hamas and Israel were likely guilty of war crimes. People didn't hear the Hamas part, they heard the Israel part loud and clear. The brand was badly tarnished. Israel went from a point of rallying cry and a unification totem for the Jewish world to, for my children's generation, Generation X, Y, and millennials, something that at best created ambivalence, and for many, a desire to run the other way. In my book, Finding a Spiritual Home, I actually talk about what I call the New American Jews. It's the attempt to identify Generation X, Y, and millennials, and I suggest 5 characteristics. And this is the market, and I want to say that what I want to do here, and I'm going to begin and end with it, is that it is critical when we move away from head down, crisis ahead, to head up. What's going on here? We need to ask 2 questions. What is going on in the market we're trying to address? A, and B, what is going on in the marketplace in which we function. Market and marketplace. I want to come back to that again and again, because all too many Jewish leaders, and those of us who are involved with training rabbis, don't ask those questions about market and marketplace. So, market. Here are 5 characteristics of what I call the New American Jew. Number 1, they don't respond emotionally to appeals based on the Holocaust or Israel. And they won't judge Israel by a different moral standard than they will any other country. 2, they are disinclined to show automatic deference to religious or community leaders. 3, they do not derive their sense of place from their Jewish connections. 4, while aware of historical anti-Semitism and the ongoing anti-Israel animus in the world, they have no persecution complex. And 5, they're willing to shop for alternative religious forms and experiences. Now, taken collectively, let's think about the big picture again, okay? Let's step back, generational change. My parents, part of the tragedy rebirth generation that builds the community that we enjoyed in the 20th century. The boomer generation, which has now moved into leadership in the community, is part of the heroic generation. We have these memories. We don't know why younger Jews don't stand up and salute when we talk about the Jewish people. Because that third generation, Generation X, Y, millennials, are part of a generation that I call the post-tribal generation. The post-tribal generation. And what's so important about understanding that is that the primary agenda of the Jewish community for the 20th century, from the end of World War II until even the present day, is what I call ethnic survivalism. It's about ethnic solidarity, and let's put the wagons around in the circle because we still have enemies in the world. And to a post-tribal generation, ethnic survivalism falls flat. It does not speak to their interests. It does not speak to their formative experiences that have shaped their consciousness. Now let's take it one more step backwards and pick our head up one more notch. Jews all too often think only about what's going on in the Jewish world, the Jewish community, but it will not serve us well unless we see what's going on in the bigger picture. The problem that we face with this post-tribal generation is not, is not unique to the Jewish community and the Jewish people. It's part of a larger American phenomenon which we must understand. The most recent book that came out by Robert Putnam, who came to prominence with his book Bowling Alone, but this is the next book, a book I recommend you called American Grace, outlines and details the crisis of what he calls religious inheritance. It simply means how well one generation passes on religious loyalty and identity to the next generation. Okay? What does he find? If you take away blacks and Hispanics who do way better at passing on religious inheritance than others, if you take them away, less than 50% of Americans are successful at passing on their religious heritage to their children. And if we take those underperforming religious groups, blacks and Hispanics aside, take the underperforming groups, and we isolate the Jews, compare them to the other unsuccessful groups, we are the least successful, the most unsuccessful, whichever way you want to put it. Less than 30% of Jews are successful at passing on their heritage, less than 30%. That tells us the picture about the market and the marketplace. One other data from the Putnam book. In 1955, they did a survey of Americans about religious preferences. And they asked a question about, what denomination or religion do you most identify with? 97% of Americans identified a denomination or some religious faith community. 97%. Okay? Those who, the remaining 3%, were classified in the 1955 study as the nuns. N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, okay? Okay? Because there's a whole chapter in Putnam's book that talks about the rise of the nuns, which is not about the Catholic Church and its convents, but rather indicating that by 1996, when they did theirs, from which they took their survey data, the nuns had climbed to 25%. From 3% to 25%, Jerry says is probably higher. Could be. Certainly in Jewish world, that's collectively in America. So take what I said about blacks and Hispanics.